Heard it here first, folks. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Who was not here last week? Okay, so just very, very brief overview. We're talking about the Celtic Saints. Done. Okay. No, that's what I wanted to start out talking about. It's always good to begin at the beginning. And so when it comes to Celtic Christianity, when it comes to the Celtic Saints, we actually don't really know when Christianity arrives in the British Isles. We don't have a sort of precise date. We know that it arrived fairly early. There's archaeological evidence, and we do have a couple of church historians or church figures, theologians, who talk a little bit about the faith spreading throughout the known world and it arriving in England fairly early. How many of y'all know the hymn Jerusalem? And did those feet in ancient times? Y'all know what that's about? So there is a legend, and that hymn was written, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, and it refers to an ancient legend about Joseph of Arimathea. So the legend goes that Joseph of Arimathea was a tradesman, fairly wealthy merchant who did a lot of trading on the waters. And that maybe, possibly, who knows, on one of his trips, he took Jesus along with him. Maybe Jesus was a teenager, maybe in his early 20s. Maybe they went to England. So maybe the Son of God's feet graced the British Isles. And so the entire text of that hymn is basically to say, what if this happened? What if, well, the text is this, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, and was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills, and was Jerusalem builded here among our dark satanic mills? Then it goes on saying, bring me my burning bow, gold, all something. And the whole sort of thrust of that hymn is, we can build this Jerusalem, we can build the presence of God where we are. So, what of the dark satanic hills? That term, satanic, and this is especially kind of troubling when you read some of the early sources. There's pagan worship in the British Isles. There's Druidism. All of this kind of ancient pagan mythological stuff is going on as Christianity comes alongside it. We actually do not have that many examples of ruined temples. Stonehenge is one of the few that remain, but that are kind of like, it is absolutely 100% obvious why that was there. That was for Druidic pagan rites that were carried out near the sort of the southwestern corner of England. And these things are in place. There is a religious tradition, a pagan religious tradition that exists in and around the areas that we're talking about as Christianity begins to arrive. And this is very important, as Rome begins to conquer and to sort of establish itself in the British Isles. You had a question?
No, in Prometheus novels, they very commonly refers to those factories, as satanic.
Yeah, so the Blake poem, the Jerusalem poem, so that dark satanic mills, he's referring to the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
Sort of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And there's a tie-in that, these satanic mills are factories that treat humans like cogs and wheels. Yes?
It's got another source, it's completely submerged.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So one of the cool things about, and we don't have that many living examples of this kind of stuff, but what we do know archaeologically, they can find some examples of this. There were altars in these pagan shrines. So the idea of sacrifice, the idea of propitiating the gods, or the idea of a relationship with the gods that requires sacrifice is in place as Christianity comes into these areas, these ideas are alive. These ideas of sacrifice and the gods being involved in our world, that is very much a part of the worldview that is in existence. So, I will read to you. Have y'all ever heard of Gildas? Anyone? Okay, great. You know, Gildas is an historian who's writing about, it's called the ruin of Britain, but Gildas presents a very interesting picture of the history of the British Isles as Rome comes in and then as Rome sort of fades away. And part of the history that Gildas presents to us is explaining something of the history or something of the religion that's in place at the time that Rome begins to set itself up. And I'll just read this whole quote to you. He's kind of writing a polemic against British Christians. He is a Christian himself, but he blames British Christians for not doing a better job. I'll leave that there. But this is what Gildas says. I shall therefore omit those ancient errors common to all the nations of the earth, in which, before Christ came in the flesh, all mankind were bound. Nor shall I enumerate those diabolical idols of my country, which almost surpassed in number those of Egypt, and of which we still see some moldering away within or without the deserted temples, with stiff and deformed features as was customary. Nor will I call out upon the mountains, fountains, or hills, or upon the rivers, which are now subservient to the use of men, but once were an abomination and destruction to them, and to which the blind people paid divine honor. So what is Gildas saying there?
It's all still around.
So there are still archaeological record examples of these pagan temples, these pagan shrines that were used for what he would define as the worship of idols. The worship of idols. What else is Gildas saying?
There were more women and more else.
Possibly. I mean, he's kind of going to an extreme to say there were more idols than Egypt, but he's talking about the worship of the natural world. Okay, so he says, I'm not going to say anything about the mountains, the fountains, the hills, all that sort of thing. So there's an element of animism or finding God or finding the divine in nature that exists that he says is misguided. Because the fountains, the mountains, the hills are all treated as deities in and of themselves. So Gildas's point is that the Christians come in and no, those aren't gods, those aren't divine in and of themselves. They're part of the created order. Gildas goes to an extreme. What's fascinating though is that the mountains, the fountains, and the hills actually allied with the Christian message. This idea of finding God in nature allied to the Christian message. We'll get into that in a second. So, a little bit more background before we get into one of the first saints that we know about. So as Rome begins to make inroads in the British Isles, there is a very interesting process that happens, and this becomes very important as Christianity comes in as well. How many of y'all know about the Roman system of pantheism? Pantheism. The gods. Where did they get their gods from? The Greeks. Okay, so we already know that the Roman system of religion is very fine with just sort of saying, oh, you got some good stuff, let's take that, that's great. We're going to make it ours now. They continue to do this. Once they're in a position of power and they have become the conquerors of the British Isles, they encounter local religious practice. And there are many gods that are out there in the Druidic sort of pantheon. But what the Romans do is they say, oh, great, your god of that fountain is sort of like Minerva. We're just going to put Minerva's name on your god, call it the same, we're good to go. There is no problem with your religion and our religion mushing together, and we're going to be fine. We call that syncretism. They're syncing everything up, and that winds up happening. But, and this is from the scholar John Mann. The interesting thing that happens with Druidic or the pagan religion that is sort of native to the British Isles. It's subservient to the natural world. It's saying, okay, we're trying to preempt or propitiate or satisfy the gods, but it's all happening outside of us. We can either say, please stop it raining, or please make it rain, but there's no way in which we're sort of on an even keel relationship where we can say to the gods, hey, if I do this, you do this. What the Roman system brings in is that dynamic, that if I make a vow to a certain god, that God will give me what I asked for, do what I have prayed about. We have heard of the Roman baths at Bath. Okay. So there's a ruin in Bath, which is, it dates back to Roman times, and it's been sort of reconstructed a little bit, but for the most part, this is kind of what, with the exception of the abbey up there in the background, that's what it would have looked like in Roman times. And in these baths, there's a massive complex. They found these inscription cards or slates that have little, well, it's mostly curses written on them. So and so stole my tunic on, the 15th day of May. Make them pay. Give them bad breath, whatever. And they drop them in the water of these baths as prayers. And some of them are sort of, curses, like make this person, I don't know, a pox on you, yes. And sometimes these inscriptions, and they've discovered quite a hoard of them. Sometimes these inscriptions are, thank you, goddess Athena, for making my person's curse happen to me. So this the idea of, I can ask a certain god for a certain thing. And if I am making a vow to this god to perform a certain action, they'll grant me what I wish. This Roman system kind of, I don't want to say steamrolls, but very quickly takes on and takes over the pagan system of just sort of, we live in the world, nothing we can do about it that much. We got to propitiate the gods. Okay. So that's also very important because as Rome begins to take over, they also had imported the idea of the Pax Deorum. You know what that means? Pax, peace, Deorum, of the gods, the peace of the gods. So we have to maintain the goodwill of the gods by continuing to have these relationships that we entered into with certain deities, or else they'll get ticked off and either abandon us, and that's not good, or make bad things happen to us, which is really not good. So this idea of the Pax Deorum becomes a little, it's allied with the pagan system there, and that's something that's in play. All of that I have said is background to the first saint that we know about, Saint Alban. Y'all ever heard of Saint Alban? Okay. We don't know anything about where Saint Alban came from. The best guess is that he was a British pagan. That's it. That's all we kind of know. That's the legends that we have about Saint Alban come sort of hundreds of years after his death. But we do know that the legends around him become sort of part of the oral tradition that is received fairly soon after his death. When he died is also a matter of debate because it's a 100-year difference, but we don't need to go down that road. So the best record of the tradition about St. Alban that we have comes from Bede's Ecclesiastical History. Remember I said we're going to talk a lot about Bede? You can start counting how many times I say his name. So in Bede's Ecclesiastical History, the story goes that Alban, pagan, living sort of northwest of London, encounters a Christian named Amphidolus, but that's not important. At the time of a persecution of Christians in Britain. and he shelters this guy. And as they are spending time together, Alban witnesses Amphipolis's devotion to God. He witnesses this man's prayer life, willingness to give up everything that he's got in service to God. He begins to learn about the faith. And this, again, is during a time of persecution. And so one day, as the story goes, the soldiers arrive, Roman soldiers arrive, they say they're looking for this priest. The priest has hightailed it, and Alban has decided, I want to be a Christian. And so he puts on the priest's gown, puts on the priest's robes. There's handing over the robes to Alban. And Alban presents himself as a Christian. He's taken before a judge. The judge says, if you will just renounce this Jesus and pay tribute to the gods so that we can maintain this Pax Deorum, you'll be fine. Alban says, that's not happening. And so he's sentenced to die. And there's a wonderful sort of series of miracles that happens as Alban is being led out to die. So they're going up to the river Vare, which is near the town of St. Albans, which is a beautiful cathedral. Anyway, the river has one bridge over it. There's so many people that have come out to witness the execution that they can't get across the bridge. And so Alban, wanting to meet his demise in a short order, asks God, can you please speed this along? And so the river dries up. And they walk across the river. Y'all heard of this before? Does that ring a bell? Yeah. So Moses parting the Red Sea, or Joshua stopping the River Jordan. So again, this the idea that these great saints are tapping into power that we know about and are taking their part in stories that have already happened. That's very much there. So they cross over the river. One of the executioner who is actually tasked with chopping off Alban's head sees this happen, sees Alban's devotion, and is so moved by it that he converts on the spot. Says, I'm with this guy. I don't know anything about y'all. I'm with this guy. So he converts. Alban is then executed, as well as the other convert. But as Bede tells us, and this is fascinating, you see the eyes falling out of the executioner's head? Some of this stuff is pretty gory. But as the story goes, the executioner does not get to enjoy the sight of his triumph. For the minute that the sword touched Alban's neck, or the minute that his head fell off, the executioner's eyes fall out. As a sort of, exemplifying that, well, God's justice is greater than yours. A later tradition about Alban, and I find this absolutely fascinating, because Bede does not include it. Alban's head rolls down the hill, and that is where a spring comes up out of the ground, and that spring is where St. Albans Cathedral is currently located. So this gets us into a very interesting sort of, again, that syncretism that happens between Rome and the pagans. It also happens between pagans and Christians. How many of y'all have ever been to a natural spring? Has it been a sort of special place that we've associated kind of spiritual things with? How about a waterfall? We kind of, we look at these water features as things of beauty, yes. But if you dig a little further down into it, they can also be mysterious places where God seems just a little more present, right? Water features, especially springs, become incredibly important. Well, they already were important in the pagan world. They become incredibly important in the Christian world as well. And we'll get there in just a second. So, a little bit about some of these springs. Wells and rivers wind up playing a major role in the establishment of Christianity and the sort of replacement of the pagan native religion. Okay, I've got two examples here. One is Saint Winifred's Well. Y'all know the dean's daughter, Julian? You know what her middle name is? Or one of her middle names? Julian Winifred Clare Wright. Winifred. So, story about Winifred is that she was the daughter of a chieftain named Ecgbert, was a Welsh nobleman. Her mother was the sister of another famous Welsh saint, Bueno or Bono. Yes, that's where he got his name. Referring to the U2 bands. Anyway, so, and this is a family that's very closely connected with the kings in Wales. And according to legend, she had a suitor named Caradog, who was enraged when she wanted to become a nun. And so what did he do? Lopped off her head. Is this sounding familiar?
Yeah.
Her head rolls down a hill. And guess what appears? A healing spring. And that's key, a healing spring. So even in spite of the fact that this tragic thing happens to this saint, her demise brings about the healing of others. There's another saint named Decuman, that's an early saint, early 8th century. And the story around him is that he was a Christian, he was saying his prayers, and a evil bad guy pagan doesn't like it, lops his head off. Guess what happens? A spring comes up out of the ground, which has powers of healing. Saint Decuman's Well. And this is where it gets even better. Saint Brigid. Y'all ever, I think it's the Bride's Head Revisited or something like that? They got the, I'm trying to remember the author's name. Anyway, Saint Brigid, Saint Bride. There are hundreds of wells dedicated to Saint Brigid in Ireland, all throughout the entire country. She's one of the patron saints of Ireland. There's 3. Can you guess the other 2? Patrick, yes. Anyone else? The 3rd? Columba. We'll get to him in just a second. So, St. Brigid, again, every town in Ireland has one holy well, some counties having upwards of 100, total of approximately 3,000 wells, and there are over 100 dedicated to one saint in particular. Now, you might not be able to see it really well. These are all different designs. This is fascinating. Can anyone guess what all these little items over here are? Prayers. Or thanksgivings or prayers answered. Does that sound familiar? So again, you've got a saint whose holy life is associated with springs that then take on that same power of healing. You see where paganism and Christianity kind of walk alongside each other. One of the fascinating things, and these wells, a lot of the ones that are dedicated to St. Brigid are supposed to be places where it's not just a sort of, general healing that happens. Can you guess what type of healing Brigid's wells might impart? She's a woman. Fertility. Isn't that fascinating? Because typically when we think of, fertility goddesses, right? That's, guess what? Brigid takes that role. In fact, some scholars, and this Brigid is, right there. Brigid herself, there's some debate as to whether or not an actual person named Brigid of Kildare ever existed. Because there was a pagan goddess named Brigid. Guess what she specialized in? Casserole. That's good. Yes, so there's this pagan deity who was worshipped. Feminine attributes. And the thought is, at least the argument is, that the Irish Christians invent Brigid to sort of take over the popularity of this pagan goddess and just create all these stories. Now, that's one argument. The other argument is Brigid was actually a person who founded monasteries, nunneries, it's very well traveled, and established a shrine where an eternal flame was kept, hence the eternal flame of that. But again, a lot of the sort of ritual observances that were associated with this pagan goddess Brigid wind up coming over to Brigid of Kildare. Now, there's a late poem that is written, or is reputed to be written by Brigid of Kildare. And I'm not so much interested in whether or not an actual person named Brigid of Kildare composed a poem. What I'm interested in is the fact that this poem is attributed to Brigid of Kildare because the person who wrote it thought this is what her audience would have wanted to hear. So that's kind of where I see the value in this. Have y'all ever heard of the Lake of Beer poem? I want to read this to you and just sort of a little bit of back and forth. So, okay. I'd like to give a lake of beer to God. What a great way to start a poem. I'd love the heavenly host to be tippling there for all eternity. I'd love the men of heaven to live with me, to dance and sing. If they wanted, I'd put at their disposal vats of suffering. White cups of love I'd give them, with a heart and a half. Sweet pitchers of mercy I'd offer to everyone. I'd make heaven a cheerful spot, because the happy heart is true. I'd make the men contented for their own sake. I'd like Jesus to love me too. I'd like the people of heaven to gather from all the parishes around. I'd give a special welcome to the women, the three Marys of great renown. I'd sit with the men, the women, and God, there by the lake of beer. We'd be drinking good health forever, and every drop would be a prayer. What do y'all think of that? Good. Is it shocking? Is it a little strange? Okay. Other thoughts?
Very Irish.
Okay. Starts off with the idea of, beer. There's another legend associated with Brigid that's it's something to do with whiskey. That she either blesses a vat of whiskey or something like that, and that's why on St. Brigid's Day, everyone's supposed to have a shot of Jameson's or something. It's probably something that Jameson invented. But anyway, but the idea here of heaven is a joyful place where we would all sort of be in community gathering around. That I love the imagery here in this kind of playful innocence or this playfulness about what heaven should be. So we'll get a little further down into this as we get to Columbatus. The idea of working our way to heaven by doing penance and making our lives miserable for the sake of God, that's still very much in existence. And if you look at the sort of especially the Syriac monastic tradition, where people wear chains and hair shirts and flagellate themselves, all this sort of thing, that it's only through suffering that we can come to know God, that's still very much in vogue. And to some degree, it's still in vogue now. The idea that our suffering is what gains us or helps to get us closer to God. And so what she's saying is, well, I'd love to dance and sing. But if that's not your thing, that's fine. We can still live together in harmony. If you want vats of suffering instead, that's fine. And so the idea here is that it ain't for everybody, but if that's what you're going to, if that's how you're going to be part of the kingdom, it's fine. We'll make that available to you. So again, it's just this sort of wonderfully innocent or wonderfully playful idea that is associated with Brigid Kildare. So, she winds up, at least according to the traditions and the story, she winds up founding monasteries and nunneries all over the place. And that is a feature that is essentially identical with Celtic Christianity as a thing. Wherever you find a famous Celtic saint, there is a monastery associated with him or her, period. Like, if you could find me an example where that's not true, I'm all ears. But every single one of these characters, at least that we have a record of, we have legends about, founds a monastery. In fact, most of them, there's a story about them going off and learning from a monastic school. Saint Columba is a perfect example of this. Saint Columba is that third patron saint of Ireland. He is born in Ireland. We don't know precisely what year, but he's born in Ireland. And as he grows up, he enrolls in a monastic school. He learns his letters. He goes on to become a sort of a very wise and discerning saint. And at the age of 44, after a very successful career as a church person, as an abbot, and he found something like, I think it's 10 or 11 monasteries by the time he's 44. I'm like, man, oh man, I can't even tie my shoes right. But he decides he's going to go off and evangelize in Scotland. And so he sets sail, crosses over from Ireland to Scotland, and founds the monastic community of Iona. Remember that name. Iona is a very, very big deal. And Iona becomes the sort of the center of Irish Christianity in the Scotland side of things in very short order. So I'm going to share with y'all one quick little vignette because it relates to the fountains piece. Okay. So this is from Adolfnan's Life at Columba. This is a story about a spring of all things. So, at the time when Columba was sojourning for some days in the province of the Picts, the blessed man heard that a report was spread abroad among the heathen people concerning another spring, which foolish men, whose senses the devil had blinded, worshipped as a god. Is this ringing a bell? Okay. For those who drank of the same spring or purposely washed hands or feet in it were smitten by demonical power, so God so permitting it, and returned either leprous or purblind, or else weak, lame, or beset by some other maladies, on account of all which things the heathens led astray, paid divine honor to the spring. On coming to the knowledge of these things, the saint one day goes boldly up to the spring, and seeing this, Druids, whom he himself had often sent away abashed and vanquished by him, greatly rejoiced, thinking that he would suffer the like things from contact with that noxious water. But he, first raising his hand, invocation of the name of Christ, washes his hands and feet, then with his companions drinks of the same water he had blessed. And from that day, the heathens departed from that spring. Not only was it permitted not to injure anyone, but also after its being blessed by the saint, his washing in it, many diseases among the people were cured by the same fountain. Okay. So we have a spring. We have a heathen spring that is worshipped as a divine thing. And then we have a Christian coming along, doing something, and all of a sudden, it's a Christian spring with the same power. Because who would go to a spring that would hurt you? No one. No one. What's happening in this story is the Christianization of a pagan site. Because I'm guessing we don't know this for sure, but we're guessing, that pagan site was associated with health. That you could go there, you could wash in it, and the god would grant you your favor. You could go there, you could drink from it, and the god would heal you from your malady. Well, that's not what we believe, because that spring has no power in and of itself. If we sanctify it, though, if we bless it in the name of Christ, Christ's power of healing is then flowed through it. And so that spring retains its power to heal, it's just baptized, which is a fascinating process. So again, and you can come across this stuff again and again and again and again. There's a story of St. Patrick going up to an oak tree that is a sort of a druidic symbol, because oaks, mighty oaks in that pagan world, were thought to have divine presence. They were thought to be divine themselves. I can't remember exactly the terms of the story, but St. Patrick has a sort of battle with a druidic priest. St. Patrick wins, that oak becomes the site of a shrine or a church that's built in honor of St. Patrick. So, does the oak get baptized? I think yes. It's not, that one's not chopped down. I think we talked last week about the oak that gets chopped in four swings and it's knocked over. Anyway. Where was the announcement? So again, Columba is the founder of dozens of monasteries throughout Ireland and into Scotland. He allies himself with a lot of the local magnates because his clan is actually quite powerful. Where he comes from in Ireland, his clan has a whole lot of clout. This also winds up being something that's fairly common in a lot of these saint stories. They are somehow related to royalty or to the nobility. They have a lot of power that comes with them. And that does, I think, wind up having a whole lot of import. So, last but not least, because I have to mention St. David of Wales, because he's my son's patron saint. David of Wales, I love this picture up here because it shows what a Celtic tonsure would have looked like. We can talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the Synod of Whitby, but it's essentially the front half of your head is shaved, the back half is kept. Normally, when we think of a tonsure, we think of, basically just, a circle around the head with a kind of, crown of hair remaining. Celtic tonsures were half your head shaved and the back half, sort of like an old school mullet. Anyway, David of Wales, again, we don't know a whole lot about him. What we do know is we do have some of his writings. That's a good thing. There's not just legends here. He becomes renowned as a Christian teacher, as a refuter of Pelagianism. In fact, the image that you see here, typically the iconography of David, it shows him with the dove of the Holy Spirit resting on his shoulder. And the legend goes that David is called upon to preach against the Pelagian heresy in Wales. He decides he's going to do this, and the dove of the Holy Spirit comes down and whispers in his ear and inspires his speeches. And as he's speaking, the ground itself mounds up underneath him. A little hillock forms, the more people could see him. Which, if you've ever been to Wales, why would you need more hills? What's the point of having another hill? Anyway, but David goes on to found, guess what? Monastic communities. A lot of them in Wales. He writes a rule of life, which has sort of got a reputation for being very severe. But one of the things that he is most well known for, and you may have heard this quote before, at his deathbed, he says this to his gathered monastic community: brothers and sisters, be joyful. Keep your faith, your creed, and do the little things that you have seen me do, that you've heard about me do. And as for me, I will walk the path that our ancestors have trod before us. Do the little things. Be faithful in the little things. That is something I think that is a great lesson for all of us. To conclude the whole thing, going back to Alba and a lot of these different sort of early saints. Why does Christianity begin to take such a foothold in these regions? And I think that the answer has something to do with the story of Alban. Alban sees someone that is so devoted to this faith, so devoted to this path, that they can't help but be attracted to it. And Christianity offers something so attractive that I can't help but be interested in seeing where this leads. And so that, I think, explains a little bit about why the church has so much success. Because the people who are coming to the British Isles are so devoted, they're so on fire with this stuff, that others see it and go, wow, we went down to the spring last week and it was Tuesday, who cares? You're saying this is all that matters. Well, gosh, that's pretty powerful. Maybe I need to explore this a little bit more and learn a little bit more. Because the message that Christianity brings into these areas is that your relationship with the gods, these votive offerings, this kind of give and take system, you kind of have to have means for that. What Christianity says is this salvation that we're talking about is open to everyone, rich and poor alike. There is no propitiating the god or the gods. There is no system of votive offerings that's going to get you into heaven. Salvation has been offered to you freely. It has been done. All you have to do is engage it. And that's it. And it cuts across social strata. It is open to all. It winds up being very successful. And I think that's part of the reason why, is that the people that are devoted to it really are devoted to it. And it's open to everybody. So, I was about to say, thank you. Okay, next Sunday we are we're off. I'm away the next 2 Sundays, but we'll pick back up Sunday in July. So, thank you, everyone. Oh gosh.